Accusations fly as Taiwan's three presidential candidates take to the stage in their first policy forum. One China, two interpretations. Taiwan's political parties disagree about the 1992 consensus. Surgeons in Taiwan complete a rare double lung transplant despite an organ shortage. Plus, villages in Taiwan become ghost towns as population decline hits rural areas. Good evening. You're watching TaiwanPlus News. I'm Eric Gao. China is cutting special tax treatment for a dozen Taiwanese chemical products. Beijing says it's retaliation for what it calls unfair Taiwanese trade restrictions on Chinese imports. The chemical products are currently covered by a 2010 bilateral agreement to reduce tariffs and trade barriers. These new tax rules will take effect January 1st, just 2 weeks before Taiwan's national elections. Taiwan's economics ministry says the move will have a very limited impact on local businesses. The three presidential candidates took the stage to outline their policies. As Sally Jensen reports, their approach to China dominated the discussion.
The first policy forum of three is over for Taiwan's presidential candidates, and there were few surprises. Standing for the ruling Democratic Progressive Party, or DPP, was current Vice President Lai Ching-te, who has a small lead in the polls. He faced off against Hou You-yi of the main opposition Kuomintang, or KMT, and the Taiwan People's Party, or TPP, candidate Ko Wen-je, Taipei's former mayor. They each got to lay out their policies, and the hottest topic was China, which claims Taiwan as part of its territory. Broadcast on local television, the forum kicked off with the KMT's Hou pressing Lai to clarify his stance on Taiwan independence, while holding up an image of Lai as a young pro-independence activist.
是不是要来骗选票，还是要来暗藏你的台独？所以看到这个情形，想着讲民进党这几年的做法，互大家有够袂放心的啦。
Hou spoke largely in Taiwanese, unusual for a KMT candidate whose party's traditional support base is older, China-friendly Mandarin speakers. Lai responded by saying that by running for president, as far as China is concerned, all three candidates are pro-independence, making them enemies in Beijing's eyes.
中国要并吞台湾，是他们的国家政策，争取世界霸权。 不是哪一个政党或哪一个人有什么主张所引起，也不是你们全盘接受中国的主张就有办法阻止。
The TPP's Kerr tried to rise above the fray, only briefly stating he supports the status quo in terms of cross-strait relations. He was more interested in talking about judicial reform, housing and urban planning, issues he considers most important to his base, Taiwan's younger voters. They are often characterized as tired of the two-party system and political bickering about China-Taiwan relations. Kerr told them to rally the support of their elders.
每天5分钟，每个礼拜至少5天。如果住在一起，就跟这些长辈，面对面讲话；如果没有住在一起，也可以打个电话给他。
The three also talked corruption, energy, and land ownership. Other domestic issues key to winning over undecided voters. With two more televised policy forums before elections in January, the candidates hope to push their agendas enough to stand apart from each other and win the public vote. Devin Tsai and Sally Jensen for TaiwanPlus.
And what does the policy forum mean for the election? Sally Jensen spoke to Ross Feingold, a political risk analyst based in Taipei, to find out.
How much do Taiwanese people pay attention to the presidential candidates' policy forum? Is policy really what drives their voting decisions?
I think that voters generally don't watch these forums or pay much attention to what's been said. An important reason for that is all the candidates have already, or they're still in the process of announcing their policies across a wide range of issues, whether that's education, childcare, elder care, public housing, other types of subsidies, and of course, China. So given that these events are not really a debate, we're not going to see any intense back and forth like we would see in American-style presidential debates. The voters do pay attention to the policies of the candidates, but given that the candidates have already announced these through other methods, they're not necessarily watching or getting any value from watching these forums.
How do you think each of the candidates performed in the forum?
I think all the candidates performed fairly equally. Again, given that there isn't a lot of back and forth the way we would see in other countries, and specifically American-style presidential candidate debates, there's not a lot of opportunity for one candidate to really shine versus the other two candidates that were on the stage. And because there are three candidates on the stage, the amount of time that any one candidate gets to speak is also somewhat limited.
What did you make of the discussion of cross-strait China-Taiwan relations issues in this policy forum?
We already know the candidates' positions on Taiwan's relationship with China. It's something that they've presented in their own press conferences. It's something that gets talked about, or they get asked by media a lot of questions about China policy. So, of course, it's unavoidable that they have to discuss it. And anyway, we know what their positions are. Lai opposes the 1992 consensus. He says he'll maintain the status quo of outgoing President Tsai's policies. And Hou Yu-ih supports the 92 consensus, and he would return to something more like Ma Ying-jeou's policy. Ko Wen-je of the Taiwan People's Party hasn't really endorsed the 92 consensus. He hasn't really said what will be different for his China policy, other than similar to other policy areas. Ko Wen-je says, I'm going to be practical about it.
Now, Sally Jensen talking with political risk analyst Ross Feingold. Now, it's not just Taiwan's presidency on the line in January's elections. Voters will also pick the country's lawmakers, both directly and by party. Joyce Sun takes a look at how this works.
When Taiwanese voters head to the polls in January, they won't just be electing the next head of state, but also its legislators, the people who pass national laws and control the president's budget. That vote has two parts: a district lawmaker, won by a single member per district in a first-past-the-post race, and the party list, essentially a party popularity contest. Votes won here will directly translate into a ratio of legislative seats.
The party list is really important because it allows the political parties to nominate the unusual candidates. Some people want to make sure that their needs at home, their local needs, are addressed, right? And the legislative election gives them the opportunity.
Out of Taiwan's 113 legislators, 73 are chosen by district. 6 are reserved for elected indigenous lawmakers, while the remaining 34 reflect party popularity. The more votes they secure, the more seats they can fill from their own pre-submitted rosters. The 3 biggest parties have seasoned politicians and lawmakers on their lists. As well as children's rights activists and academics, there are also more controversial figures, like President Tsai Ing-wen's 2020 election competitor, Han Kuo-yu. As the top-seeded pick of the opposition Kuomintang, or KMT, the recalled ex-Kaohsiung city mayor could be the next parliamentary speaker if the KMT wins a legislative majority. A move analysts say is strategic to make up for what their presidential pick, new Taipei Mayor Hou Yu-ih, lacks.
Hou Yu-ih is sort of weak, not only in eloquence. Hou Yu-ih also suffered from the lack of knowledge in international politics. Han Kuo-yu has a great sense of humor. He knows how to express in a very interesting way. He can bring a lot of momentum, can instigate a lot of controversy against the DPP if DPP is going to be the next ruling party.
The ruling DPP, or Democratic Progressive Party, has held the legislative majority for the past 8 years. The KMT's stake has been sizable with 37 seats, while the TPP, or Taiwan People's Party, occupies 5 spots, with the rest scattered across smaller parties. The legislature is the main arena to debate issues that will affect daily life here. And with Taiwan's top office often dominated by geopolitics, these lawmakers will be the ones most likely to hear and act on the domestic needs of the people, making the legislative elections just as critical as the presidential one. Justin Wu and Joyce Sun in Taipei for TaiwanPlus.
KMT presidential hopeful Hou Yu-ih says his views on cross-strait relations are in line with the country's constitution.
我坚持台湾的民主自由制度。
我反对一国两制，反对台独。
Now, Ho's comments come after members of the ruling DPP said that his party's adherence to the 1992 consensus was outdated. That consensus is an agreement on one China between the KMT and the Chinese Communist Party. The KMT says the consensus allows the two sides to maintain dialogue and therefore peace. The DPP rejects this agreement, though. Ho said laws cannot force the two sides to recognize each other's sovereignty, adding that Taiwan's future will be decided by its own people. For more on how the 1992 consensus has shaped Taiwan's politics, Jeremy Olivier brings us this report.
As Taiwan's national election nears, the candidates from the country's two major parties, the ruling Democratic Progressive Party and its rival, the Kuomintang, are retreading familiar ground, Taiwan's fraught relationship with China. They're debating whether Taiwan should accept something called the 1992 consensus, a deeply controversial idea in Taiwan. Some say it's not even a consensus. And when asked if they could explain it, here's what people in Taipei had to say.
9·2共识就是一个中国两个不同的政也不叫政府啊，两个地区吧。对对对，然后大家都承认是一个中国了。
我只知道它跟一个中国不太是完全一模一样的概念，有一点像是类似模糊在一个中国界限之间的东西。
其实我也没有到非常的了解，但觉得其实台湾如果是自己一个独立的国家的话，或许还不错。
So how has such a fragile concept once again become a central debate in Taiwan's election? Because the consensus isn't that well defined. The 1992 consensus refers to an unwritten agreement between the KMT and the Chinese Communist Party. Under it, both sides agree there is one China, which includes Taiwan, but they're free to interpret that as they want. For the KMT, that's the Republic of China, Taiwan's official name. But for the CCP, it means the People's Republic of China. Basically, the two sides agree to disagree. But how did this idea come about? To answer that, we'll need to go back a bit. For much of the 20th century, the governments in Taiwan and China had no official contact with each other. That changed in the late 1980s when Taiwan began shifting to a democracy. By the early 1990s, the two sides agreed to hold a series of talks to begin normalizing relations. But for those meetings to happen, they had to agree on Taiwan's status, and to avoid any awkward situations. That's how they arrived at the one China, different interpretations formula. It wasn't until years later that a KMT official gave it the name 1992 Consensus. The KMT says those exchanges have laid the foundation for cross-strait relations for the past 3 decades. It says the 1992 consensus gives Taiwan the room to deal with China without making either side uncomfortable.
Today, we continue to prove that it is useful and it's also a guardrail to slow down, to ease the cross-strait conflict, cross-strait tensions. So I think this is very important for the regional stability and peaceful environment.
But the DPP disagrees. It says the term is simply another way of accepting Beijing's stance that Taiwan is part of the People's Republic of China. The DPP has refused to adopt it in its approach to cross-strait relations, something that has angered China.
If Taiwan admits or readmits the 1992 consensus or the one China principle again, then it will be highly misleading to the world that Taiwan wants to be part of China. So that has a severe consequence.
Supporting the DPP's argument is China, which has made it clear that it was never on board with the KMT's different interpretations idea. For Beijing, the 1992 consensus is no different than any of the other phrases it uses to lay claim to Taiwan.
要贯彻新时代党解决台湾问题的总体方略，坚持一个中国原则和9·2共识。
Even some in the KMT are ready to let the term go, especially after losing popularity from being seen as too pro-China. Legislator Johnny Jiang tried to retire it during his brief stint as party chair in 2020, and current chair Eric Zhu has called it a no consensus consensus. But strong supporters of the concept continue to hold a lot of power in the KMT, which means that as long as the party is a force in Taiwanese politics, the 1992 consensus will likely be around to stay. Alex Chen and Jeremy Olivier for TaiwanPlus.
Chinese President Xi Jinping told U.S. President Joe Biden that his country will unify with Taiwan. An exclusive report from NBC cited 3 current and former U.S. officials who were briefed on the two-leader summit last month in San Francisco. They said Xi told Biden that Beijing does not have a time frame to take Taiwan and that it would prefer to do so peacefully. He reportedly said U.S. predictions of an attack on Taiwan in a specific year were wrong. China views Taiwan as part of its territory, but Taiwan's public overwhelmingly rejects the idea of being ruled by Beijing. Surgeons in Taiwan have completed a rare double lung transplant. It comes amid a shortage of organ donations in the country. Reese Ayers has the story.
For almost 10 hours, a team of surgeons worked on one of the most difficult procedures in medicine, a double lung transplant. One of fewer than 20 such procedures in Taiwan this year, doctors say this transplant was the only chance Mr. Lee had to survive.
慢性阻塞性肺病这一块，如果做的这个肺脏移植手术，可以显著的换了新的肺脏之后，那手术也顺利成功的话，那是可以显著改善他的生活品质。
Mr. Lee was fortunate on several counts. Organ donations are in extremely short supply in Taiwan, with waiting lists as long as 2.5 years. What's more, surviving the complex procedure is a challenge in itself. For Mr. Lee's son, his father's survival was a massive blessing.
感谢你们这2个半月以来对我父亲病情的照顾，只有体会过的人才知道你们付出了多少的心血。
In addition to a lack of organ donations, very few surgeons can perform such a difficult operation. Taiwanese surgeons have to first train and become qualified overseas to perform organ transplants. But improvements in medical techniques are helping increase patient survival rates.
双侧的一个前开胸，我们手术视野会比较小，主要是对病人的疼痛跟恢复是比较好的。这也代表说我们有能力可以去做这样比较小伤口的一个手术。
More than 5,000 people die of lung disease in Taiwan every year, making it the 7th leading cause of death in the country. And experts say that smoking accounts for over 70% of lung disease cases globally. Until Taiwan can source more organ donors and qualified surgeons, transplant success stories like Mr. Lee's will remain few and far between. Dolphine Chen and Reese Ayers for TaiwanPlus.
Coming up after the break, we look at how resources are running out for Taiwan's aging population.
For more stories from here at the Twin Oaks Estate and around the world, make sure to visit TaiwanPlus News on social media.
Taiwan votes for a future after President Tsai.
A new leader to manage ties with Washington and Beijing.
And find balance in a volatile region. In an election that could reshape our world.
TaiwanPlus, your guide in uncertain times.
Bringing you analysis from Taiwan and abroad.
Immediate reactions as the results roll in.
And a deep dive into Taiwan's future.
Join us on election night for our live specials. Taiwan Talks, Taiwan Votes, and Taiwan Connects. Only on TaiwanPlus.
Welcome back. You're watching TaiwanPlus News. Over 20,000 Palestinians have died in the fighting in Gaza, according to the Enclave's health ministry. Tiffany Wong has this update.
The Gaza Strip, now the most dangerous place for children, according to the UN. Gaza's health ministry says 20,000 people, nearly 1% of the population, have been killed here since the start of the Israel-Hamas conflict over 2 months ago, sparking urgent calls for humanitarian aid and a ceasefire. 70% of those killed were women and children.
We are now coming to the end of what was the deadliest year in the occupied Palestinian territory. This should be a wake-up call that the current status quo cannot be allowed to continue.
A U.S. report pointed to Israel's use of unguided missiles for the high civilian casualties in Gaza, but Israel claims to only be targeting Hamas forces and blamed underground tunnels allegedly used by Hamas's leaders for putting civilian lives at risk. Israel launched an offensive after Hamas attacked in October, taking over 200 hostages, and has insisted on military action to free them.
כל מחבלי החמאס, מהראשון עד האחרון, הם בני מוות. יש להם רק שתי אפשרויות, להיכנע או למות.
Half of Gaza's population is reported to be starving, as Israeli airstrikes and ground attacks have cornered Palestinians in the southern Gaza Strip, near the border with Egypt. The country is one of the few entry points for humanitarian aid to Palestinians, but shipments are heavily monitored by Israel, and the U.S., which is Israel's biggest ally, has delayed a vote on a UN Security Council aid resolution in order to maintain Israeli oversight.
We continue to believe that Israel does not have to choose between removing the threat of Hamas and minimizing the toll on civilians in Gaza. It has an obligation to do both, and it has a strategic interest to do both.
American officials have repeatedly voted against UN resolutions that call for a ceasefire, claiming that Israel has the right to defend itself against Hamas until all the hostages are freed. But Hamas leaders say there must be a complete ceasefire before they free any hostages, leaving Palestinian civilians trapped in the cycle of conflict. Ryan Wu and Tiffany Wong for TaiwanPlus.
North Korean dictator Kim Jong-un is threatening to launch a nuclear attack if provoked. The country's state media says Kim issued this warning while meeting North Korea's missile force. This follows Pyongyang's ballistic missile test on Monday. The U.S. and its allies condemned that launch and have been strengthening their approach to North Korea in recent months. The EU is investigating if China is dumping biodiesel imports into the bloc, hurting the European market. EU producers have accused China of selling the alternative fuel at artificially low prices that are difficult to compete with. The EU's stake in biodiesel is worth some $34 billion a year, and it's the cause of regular disputes with its trading partners. Earlier this year, the bloc launched a probe into biodiesel from Indonesia over an alleged loophole around EU duties. Taiwan is struggling to meet the challenges of its aging population, changes that many other countries will soon face. Bryn Thomas has this story.
Taiwan has spent more money on long-term care in 2023 than ever before, but over $2 billion was still not enough to meet the country's ever greater need to care for its elderly population. This problem came into harsh focus in the past week when a man in the sovereign city of Tainan was arrested for killing his ill mother. Reports said the stress of taking care of her was too much for him. In Taiwan, looking after elderly people is a responsibility that often falls on their immediate family or migrant workers. Healthcare professionals say help is available for these caregivers, but many struggle to find it.
我们知道很多照顾者他其实是不习惯求助的。我们体系内其实是有照顾者支持系统，那可是其实还有不普及的地方哦。
Despite Taiwan's record budget this year for long-term care, people in the industry say medical capacity is the bigger issue.
在医疗推行这么多年哦。 那可是使用者可以使用到的民众其实是很少哈，因为这个根结问题其实还是在那个供给面不足了哈。
Taiwan is not the only country facing these challenges. Neighboring Japan and South Korea have similarly aging societies and their own plans to meet rising demands for long-term care. But for Taiwan, the ability to look after its older population will come down to the resources it's willing to commit to its caregivers. Luffy Lee, Philip Broussard, and Bryn Thomas for TaiwanPlus.
Residents in one of Taiwan's most rapidly shrinking towns are trying to revive the area. Tiffany Wong reports.
This is Dawu Township on Taiwan's southeastern coast, home to lush forests and, every year, fewer people. But Pan Meiyuan has gone against the tide, choosing to return to Dawu after years as a broadcaster in Taipei. Now back home, she's opened a bookstore in her parents' hotel.
我小时候刚好是经历这边大武山脉的伐木时代，各种的味道、各色的口音、各种的肤色，其实我小时候就很喜欢把它们当成一本一本的书，故事书。
And to keep the town's stories alive, Pan is using her broadcast experience to keep residents connected, including the area's indigenous Taiwan. She hosts a program on the town's development on the local indigenous radio station. Dawu is one of over 100 towns that the country's National Development Council has said are at risk of being abandoned, having lost a third of its population since the 1980s, with less than 6,000 residents left. To attract more people, guided tours of the area's hidden gems are being offered by those who want to see their hometown revitalized.
祝福我们这个地方，祝福我们故乡能够更好、更美好，然后年轻人能够回来，就像美元这样子。
Population decline is an issue that's increasingly affecting all aspects of life in Taiwan, from elderly care to upholding traditions, with the burden falling heavily on younger generations. But with the help of these returnees, the future of Dawu is no longer as bleak, as they create more stories to pass on to the next generation. Dolphine Chen and Tiffany Wong for TaiwanPlus.
Thanks for joining us this evening on TaiwanPlus News. Finally, check out these dresses from Pakistan's biggest bridal extravaganza, with 9 designers showing off their works on opening day. I'm Eric Gao. Take care. Stay warm.